The wooden planks felt like ice beneath Clara's face, their rough texture pressing splinters into her skin through the tears in her dress. Every time she tried to breathe, it felt like shards of glass sliding down her throat. There was a grinding sensation inside her chest with each slight movement, a pain too intense to dismiss. She understood what her body was telling her. Her ribs hadn't simply been hurt, they'd been shattered. "My ribs are already broken," she breathed into the stillness of the cabin. The words came out so quietly they barely disturbed the floating dust particles that danced lazily through. A beam of sunlight streaming through the damaged window, heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden porch outside. Once upon a time, that familiar sound had brought comfort. Back in the days when Jeremiah was the protective older brother who chased away her nightmares. But everything changed after alcohol consumed him. When their father passed away, Jeremiah's rage became the only thing she could count on in their household. The footsteps came to a halt. Clara remained perfectly still, not daring to breathe, hoping desperately he might turn away. That perhaps tonight would be different. Occasionally it was. Sometimes the tempest inside him would subside, leaving him subdued, occasionally even remorseful. But this wasn't one of those nights. The door ground against its hinges as it swung open. Clara stayed motionless. Experience had taught her a brutal lesson. Meeting his gaze during these episodes only made things worse. Staying invisible was safer. Becoming insignificant was survival. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." She hadn't noticed him approaching. His sharp words yanked her from the numbing haze of agony. Clara dragged her eyes upward, first seeing his weathered boots, the leather worn and stained nearly black. Then his hands came into view, knuckles split and bloodied from whatever violence he'd inflicted before turning his attention to her. At last, his eyes washed out blue, reminiscent of their mother's once, now empty and lifeless. "You believe you're above the tasks I assign you?" he said, his tone measured and controlled. Yelling would have been preferable. His calm voice always signaled something worse. That quietness meant something colder than fury had taken root. Clara wanted to respond, to protest that she cooked and cleaned and repaired without objection, but the words wouldn't come. "Father used to say, you inherited too much of mother's nature," Jeremiah murmured, pacing around her like a hunter stalking prey. "Said it would weaken you." Turns out he was correct, hearing their parents mentioned, cut deeper than any physical strike. Their father had been demanding but just, and their mother had been loving until illness claimed her life. Neither would have recognized the monster Jeremiah had transformed into. "Stand up." Clara planted her hands on the floor, attempting to push herself upward, but the searing pain in her chest exploded white-hot. And she crumpled back down with a cry that dissolved into weeping. "I told you to stand up." This time, his boot connected with her shoulder. Not hard enough to cause new fractures, but forceful enough to send her sprawling against the wall. She huddled there, trembling as something delicate within her shattered. Not merely bones this time. Something more profound. Something that had held on to the possibility. He might someday return to who he was. That small ember of hope died right there on that cabin floor. "You're completely useless," Jeremiah snarled, contempt dripping from every word. Clara remained silent, focusing on how the light moved across the far wall. Minutes dragged by. Eventually darkness would fall, and he'd drink until unconsciousness claimed him. Granting her a brief respite before sunrise brought the pattern around again. But crumpled against that wall, Clara felt something unfamiliar spark within her chest. It wasn't tranquility. It wasn't optimism. Not completely, anyway. But similar. A quiet voice suggesting that perhaps existence held more than this wooden prison. More than Jeremiah's violence. More than suffering masquerading as familial obligation. Perhaps somewhere in the world there were people who used their strength to shield others, not wound them. Perhaps there were places where simply breathing didn't come with a price paid in bruises. The notion was perilous. She tried to dismiss it, but it refused to disappear. Instead, it took root inside her, tiny but persistent. That evening, while Jeremiah's snores rumbled from the back room, Clara rose with painstaking care. Each motion sent lightning bolts of pain through her ribcage. But she'd become an expert at navigating through suffering the way water flows around stones. Her unshod feet found the boards that wouldn't betray her with creaks, the route she'd committed to memory through countless silent nights. The door loomed before her like an ultimatum. She'd gazed at it countless times before, but never while contemplating passing through it and never coming back. Her fingers wrapped around the cold iron handle. The metal bit into her palm, but she maintained her grip. Behind her, Jeremiah's breathing was deep and rhythmic. He wouldn't stir for hours, especially not after a night of drinking. The handle lifted with a barely audible click. The door swung open. The morning breeze struck her face, crisp and pure. So unlike the stagnant cabin atmosphere that had momentarily disoriented her. Overhead, the heavens expanded infinitely, almost too vast to comprehend. The porch felt foreign under her bare feet. Just yesterday morning, she'd swept these same boards, still believing she could survive one more day. Now every stride carried her further from the person she'd been and closer to an uncertain future. At the porch's edge, Clara glanced back. From this vantage point, the cabin appeared diminished, more menacing, somehow just a wound upon the landscape. She didn't turn around again. The dusty path stretched out pale and weathered toward the forest. Clara had traveled it before, but never past the stream or the tree line, never into the unknown. Each step ignited agony in her side, but she pushed forward. By noon, the sun blazed down on her shoulders, her tattered dress clinging with perspiration. Her bare feet developed cuts and bled against the harsh terrain. She fell repeatedly, each recovery more difficult than the last, but still she continued. Terror propelled her as much as hope. Every noise a bird's call, a snapping twig made her pulse race with the fear that Jeremiah might already be tracking her. She knew his nature. He wouldn't simply let her disappear. By late afternoon, Clara collapsed beside a large rock, leaning against its sun-warmed surface. Her water supply was depleted, her throat coated with grit. The landscape surrounding her grew increasingly wild and desolate. No fences, no signs of civilization. Perhaps this was her ending. Perhaps she'd traveled far enough to die free beneath. Sky too expansive for Jeremiah to imprison, but then she heard hoofbeats. Initially, she mistook it for her own heart pounding wildly. But the sound clarified. A horse approaching rapidly, coming closer. Terror seized her. Clara attempted to rise, attempted to run, but her body had exhausted its reserves. She hauled herself a short distance into the shade of a scrubby pine, hoping to disappear into stillness. The hoofbeats decelerated, then stopped. "Steady there, Ranger." "Steady," a man's voice said, deep and calm. Clara froze completely. Boots touched the ground, moving in her direction. "Miss," his voice held no menace, only concern. "Are you injured?" Clara kept her eyelids closed, wishing he'd leave. But his presence was undeniable, close by. His shadow fell across her, and when she eventually opened her eyes, she found herself looking up at a stranger, broad-shouldered, sun-weathered, and wind-worn, but with deep brown eyes that held something she'd nearly forgotten could exist: compassion. And when she spoke, almost inaudibly, "My ribs are already broken," something changed in his expression. He didn't show pity. He didn't recoil. He simply acknowledged it with a nod, his voice solid as bedrock. "I can see that." Thomas Garrett didn't advance. He remained in a crouch several feet away, as if understanding that too much distance might feel like abandonment, while too little might feel threatening. His horse exhaled softly behind him, the sound peaceful, almost inquisitive, as though the creature sensed Clara posed no danger. "You've been traveling quite a while," Thomas said gently. His dark eyes surveyed her torn clothing, her bleeding bare feet, the bruising visible beneath the fabric. Clara wanted to respond, to prove her voice still worked, but her throat only produced a rasp. "Since sunrise." Thomas nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Name's Thomas Garrett. Don't figure you need to share yours unless you're willing." The option he offered stunned her. No one had given her autonomy in ages. She grasped at the sound of her own name as if it might evaporate if left unspoken. "Clara." He echoed it softly, tasting the word. "Clara, that's a fine name. A powerful name." She nearly laughed bitterly at the concept. Powerful. Her ribs were fractured, her body failing, her spirit fragmented like weathered timber. But Thomas said it without critique, without expectation, as if he simply accepted it as truth. "You're badly hurt," he said. "Beyond just the ribs." She tensed, half anticipating anger for her silence. Instead, he simply waited, immovable as granite. "Someone inflicted this," he stated finally. "Not an inquiry. A conclusion." Claire's breathing hitched. For the first time in years, she nodded. His jaw clenched, the line of it pronounced in the afternoon sunlight, but his voice stayed level. "Are they pursuing you?" Clara's mouth opened, but her voice fractured into silence. Somehow, Thomas comprehended. He gave a slight nod. "Then we'd better get you somewhere secure." He stood gradually, his hands visible and empty, demonstrating he posed no threat. "I have a cabin not far from here. Peaceful place, strong walls. Are you willing to trust me that much?" Trust. The concept felt weighty, alien. Trust had always betrayed her, cutting when she dared to hold it. Yet studying him, she detected no predatory intent, no hidden cruelty in his gaze-only patient steadiness. She tried to stand, but her body refused. Her legs gave way, ribs screaming their protest. "I understand," Thomas murmured, as if perceiving her struggle. "That's perfectly fine. I have capable hands." He approached slowly, as if nearing a frightened animal. "Going to help you now?" he said. She managed the slightest nod. Thomas gathered her into his arms as if she were weightless, his touch deliberate, his strength understated. Pain flared through her chest, but he stabilized her, murmuring, "Easy, you're safe." The horse lowered its muzzle as Thomas carried her near. It was a large chestnut gelding, kind-eyed and patient, not the sort of animal a cruel man would own. "Nearly there?" Thomas whispered as he positioned her against the saddle. He mounted behind her with practiced efficiency, his arms supporting her without constricting, allowing her space even while holding her secure. "You can rest against me if needed," he said. Clara tried to remain upright, tried to demonstrate she wasn't entirely destroyed, but the agony sliced through her with each inhalation. And finally, she permitted herself to lean back. His chest was firm, his heartbeat rhythmic, cadence that grounded her as the horse moved forward. The trees enclosed them, cool shadows replacing the brutal sun. For the first time since fleeing the cabin, Clara's body relaxed. Not in trust, not yet, but in surrender to complete exhaustion. "Nearly there," Thomas repeated. And when she opened her eyes, she witnessed it. A log structure nestled in a clearing, smoke rising from its chimney, a tidy garden tended by careful hands. It didn't resemble a cage. It looked like possibility. Thomas dismounted first, then assisted her down. Her legs trembled beneath her, but his arms steadied her without coercion. "Come along," he said quietly. "Let's bring you inside." The door remained open, pouring golden lamplight into the twilight. Clara's heart raced at the sight. Illumination had never signified safety in her experience. But standing there with Thomas's hand hovering near her arm, prepared to catch her if she stumbled, she felt the tentative awakening of something she believed she'd lost permanently. Hope. "My ribs are already broken," she whispered, almost to herself. Thomas's eyes met hers in the dimming light. "Then we'll give them time to mend," he said simply. And for the first time in years, Clara moved forward toward warmth rather than away from violence. The cabin carried scents of pine and wood smoke, not perspiration and alcohol like the place she'd abandoned. A handmade quilt rested folded on a chair, sewn with colors that reminded Clara of wildflowers she'd gathered as a little girl. Everything in the space felt touched by care. Thomas led her to a bed near the fireplace. He didn't loom, didn't encroach on her space, simply positioned a pillow at her back and draped a blanket over her lap. Momentarily, Clara didn't know how to react. Her body prepared for rage, for the brutal words that typically followed quiet, but none materialized. Only the gentle crackling of flames. "I'll bring some water," Thomas said. His voice held no directive, only quiet respect, as if her presence was something precious he didn't want to damage. When he came back, he knelt and steadied the tin cup as she drank. Cool water traveled down her throat, washing away dust and terror. Her eyes moistened, not from physical pain, but from the unexpected kindness of it. "You're protected here," Thomas said. He didn't interrogate her story. Not immediately. He didn't require her truth before she was prepared. He simply offered the gift of silence, one devoid of judgment. Night arrived. Clara drifted through fitful sleep, occasionally waking to the sound of Thomas moving throughout the cabin. Each time she opened her eyes, she found him sitting close by, carving by lamplight or repairing equipment, his presence constant as the stars beyond the walls. By daybreak, Clara awakened to the aroma of cornbread baking. Her ribs still ached, her feet remained raw, but something within her felt less burdened. Thomas set a plate on the table. "Eat whatever you're able. You'll require your strength." She consumed a few morsels, each one bringing more comfort than any meal she'd experienced in years. For the first time, food didn't represent a demand or a negotiation. It represented caring. When the silence extended too long, Clara discovered her voice. "He was my brother." Thomas didn't flinch. He set his cup down deliberately and nodded. "I suspected it was someone family." "He wasn't always this way," she whispered. "But after Father died, something shattered in him, and he shattered me as well." Her ribs pulsed at the confession, as if confirming they bore witness. Thomas's expression softened. "Some men lose their way when sorrow arrives, but that doesn't grant them permission to inflict cruelty on others." Clara's throat constricted. No one had ever stated it so plainly. No one had ever dared call what Jeremiah did by its true name: cruelty. "You don't owe his darkness your existence," Thomas continued. Clara closed her eyes, battling tears. She'd assumed escaping the cabin was the most difficult part, but hearing truth spoken openly, hearing her trauma acknowledged and named, that was harder still. "Will he come looking for me?" she finally asked. Thomas's jaw set with determination. "If he does, he'll encounter me. I don't tolerate men who brutalize women, and he won't lay a hand on you again." The words were steady, not boastful. Thomas delivered them like a vow etched in granite. Something transformed deep within Clara, then a burden she'd shouldered for years began to dissolve, replaced not by absolute certainty, but by the fragile seeds of trust. Days unfolded. Clara's ribs started to heal. Her gait grew more confident. She contributed in the garden when capable, her hands learning to nurture soil rather than scrubbing away fury. Each evening, Thomas would sit beside her on the porch, the expansive prairie sky opening overhead. One night, as stars illuminated the horizon, Clara whispered, "I'm not certain I'll ever stop being frightened." Thomas looked at her, his voice quiet but certain. "Fear may linger, but it doesn't get to control you. You've already walked away from the worst of it." Clara held his gaze, and for the first time in years, she believed it might actually be true. She thought of that initial moment shattered on the earth, whispering her anguish. And now, seated beneath the boundless sky, she realized she wasn't whispering any longer. Her ribs would heal. Her heart would heal more slowly, but it too would recover. Because for the first time, she wasn't isolated. And in Thomas's quiet strength, Clara discovered the courage to believe in existence beyond cruelty.